Good day. Today is Sunday, the 22nd December 2024, and like some of my other videos, today's video will indeed be shorter since I have certain commitments I must fulfill to my family today in the run-up to Christmas. But nonetheless, lots is going on in the world, and there are various important topics which I would like to touch on. But first, I'm going to return to the topic of the Oreshnik missile and its attack back in some weeks ago on the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro, which was the first demonstration of its capabilities. Now, following that attack, Professor Theodor Postol gave several interviews in which he discussed his own understanding of the Oreshnik and of its capabilities, which I've discussed on this program. The engineer who runs the YouTube channel Millennium 7, he's also discussed the Oreshnik in ways which I find have increasingly, Professor Postol's and Millennium 7's opinions about the Oreshnik have converged. There's been some pushback against some of the things that Professor Postol has said from some people, which I've also discussed in various programs. But the missing problem, the great difficulty that everybody up to now has had in discussing the Oreshnik and its capabilities, is the shortage of information about the actual damage that this missile inflicted on the Yuzhmash factory. There's been a complete blackout of information about the damage to the Yuzhmash factory provided by official sources. The Ukrainians have not released pictures or information about this. The Western governments have barely commented on the issue. So we have been left literally in the dark. And there have been satellite photos, but it's not always easy to make out exactly what those satellite photos tell us. The pictures that have been provided all seem to suggest minimal damage to the Yuzhmash factory, completely inconsistent with what President Putin has been saying. And my impression is, based on things that Professor Postol and Millennium 7 have been saying, contrary also to the laws of physics, even if you go along with the premise, which is the one we've been led to assume, that the warheads that were carried by the Oreshnik were inert, solid metal warheads, that they carried no explosive. Well, as I discussed a couple of days ago, a fascinating article appeared, published on Substack by someone called Amerikanets, who writes under the name of Amerikanets, something which suggests to me, as I said, that he's a person of Russian extraction based in the United States. And he had obtained his own satellite information, and he provided a detailed discussion of the damage done to the Yuzhmash factory based on this satellite information, which he had himself obtained from a Western satellite company. And he came overall to the conclusion that the information corroborated the opinions about the Oreshnik expressed by Professor Postol. And I discussed this article at length in one of my recent programs. Except, of course, that it now turns out that the entire premise upon which this article by Amerikanets was based was completely wrong. And I should say that we know that it's wrong because Amerikanets has come out himself and has said as much. he's written an article, a new article, Mea Maxima Culpa. He has in a very dignified and proper way, completely acknowledged his own errors in a way which, by the way, has enhanced my respect for him as an analyst. And, well, the long and the short of it is that the satellite photos which he was provided by the satellite providing company that he contacted, that these, though they purport to have been made, in fact, almost certainly they were made after the attack on the Yuzhmash factory, they actually show no damage from the Oreshnik strike at all. All of the damage that they show was carried out, was done as a result of previous missile strikes on the Yuzhmash factory conducted by the Russians, extending all the way back to 2023. And in fact, it's possible to track and identify the damage from these earlier missile strikes. He does this in his second follow-up article, which he acknowledges was based on comments made to him in response to his first article by various persons. And he also acknowledges that he's had assistance from various people in providing him with the information upon which he's based this second article. Though, of course, as he makes clear also, the opinions, the ultimate analysis of all of this comes from him. And he makes the point that there is no actual damage in the satellite photos that he has been provided with, which can be attributed to the Oreshnik at all. So that begs questions. And he says that there are possibly three answers to these questions. Answer one is that all of the warheads on the Oreshnik missed the target, and that the entire factory, as a result, was completely undamaged. The second is that no damage was done because the warheads were complete duds and they burned up in the atmosphere, and everybody knows that. And the result is that what was just a test was carried out, but there was no actual damage done at all. And the third is that the satellite photos have in some way been faked. And given that he ordered them directly from the relevant satellite company, it must presumably have been done by them. Now, as he absolutely rightly says, there are problems with the first two theories. The theory that the Oreshnik missed the Yuzhmash factory, and the theory that the warheads were duds and inflicted no damage. And he provides some technical reason why both are unlikely, though I should say that this was a test. It's conceivable that guidance for some of the warheads meant that they did go astray in what was an early vehicle. And it's also the case that perhaps these were indeed dud warheads and they did burn up in the atmosphere before they reached the target. But I also think that this is unlikely. And of course, I am not a technical person, but the reason I think it is unlikely to the point of being implausible, is because if that were indeed the case, if all of the warheads had missed the target, or if the warheads had indeed been duds, so that minimal damage on the Yuzhmash factory had been caused, I would have expected the Ukrainians to claim this at far greater length, to brag about this to an extent that they have not done, to perhaps arrange tours of the factory, or at least special facilities in the factory by Western journalists, to do all of the usual things intended to discredit the Oreshnik and to win for Ukraine, and by the way, by extension for the West, the propaganda battle over the Oreshnik's capabilities. Instead, nothing like that has been done. I understand, in fact, that even as of the time of speaking, the area of the Yuzhmash factory continues to be sealed off by the Ukrainians. Certainly that appeared to be the case in the early days, directly after the attack. So, if it cannot be one or two of the explanations that Amerikanets gave, then it must be three. As Sherlock Holmes always used to say, that once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true. That, by the way, is wrong at multiple levels. That is not how it actually works in the science of investigation. But you can, up to a point, apply that logic in some situations, and it looks as if this is one of them. If it is most unlikely, to the point of being far-fetched and even fanciful, that the Oreshnik missed the Yuzhmash factory, and if it is similarly far-fetched and fanciful that these were simply dud warheads that burned up in the atmosphere and did no damage whatsoever. I mean, we've even got pictures, after all, of the missiles impacting with all the bright lights that come from that. Though I accept that might be an atmospheric phenomenon. I'm not the person to discuss or debate any of that sort of thing. Then, as I said, once you've eliminated those two extremely unlikely possibilities, you are left with the least unlikely one, which is that the satellite images have been distorted. Rather like Amerikanets, I have to say I am a bit concerned about the implications of this. First of all, he does say that it does appear, based on evidence of the foliage, the condition of the foliage, that it is most unlikely that he has been provided with photos of the Yuzhmash factory taken before the strike took place. They might have been taken literally minutes before or hours before the strike took place, but that would imply some degree of pre-warning that there was going to be this strike. We do know that there were some warnings provided by the Russians, perhaps greater than we know of, though the Russians did misdirect a little by suggesting at one point that the strike would be on targets in Kiev. Well, maybe that was what happened, and these are photos that were made, as I said, just before the Oreshnik was struck the target, based on anticipation of the strike, based on the warnings that the Russians gave. I find that very difficult to believe, as Amerikanets does. So that leaves us then with the only remaining option, which is that the photos have been doctored in some way in order to conceal the damage that was actually done. Now, Amerikanet is not at all clear how this could have been done. I've heard it suggested that photoshopping might have been applied. That would have had to be done on a huge scale. Maybe that is, however, what happened. I am not an expert in doctoring photos, though I accept, no, that with modern technologies, astonishing things can be done about this. And perhaps most importantly, Amerikanet has pointed out that other photos that he's seen of the Yuzhmash factory made earlier also appear to show signs of manipulation in order to conceal damage. So it looks as if there's good reason to think that this is indeed happening and that we have been given a completely misleading set of photos which have been doctored to give a distorted picture and to conceal the actual extent of the damage that was really done. That, at the moment at least, seems the most likely explanation. In which case, just to say, in which case, if American and Western companies, presumably acting on someone's instructions, are taking these sort of steps and are going to these extreme lengths to conceal the extent of the damage done by the Oreshnik to the Yuzhmash factory, then that strongly argues for the damage to have been perhaps on the same immense scale that was suggested by the early reports. Just saying. And as it happens, a couple of days ago, I saw what purported to be a photo of a crater, a huge crater, absolutely shockingly vast crater, which purportedly had been made at the Yuzhmash factory, showing the impact of one of these projectiles from the Oreshnik, which had hit the Yuzhmash factory. I have to say I'm not at all clear about the provenance of this photo or the location, and possibly it's a photo of another crater photographed in some completely different place, and it could be the result of a Fab 3000, which I do know can leave enormous craters. So I'm not placing any great weight on this particular photo. But anyway, whatever, it looks as if we're no wiser about what really happened to the Yuzhmash factory and about what the capabilities of the Oreshnik actually are. Perhaps, as I said, this was just a demonstration of its range and potential power. Either it missed the target, which I think, as I said, is all but inconceivable, or the rounds that it launched against the target were literal blanks, which again seems to me to make very little sense and to be inconsistent with the information. Or, as I said, it does look as if someone is working very hard to conceal this information, which can lead us to draw inferences about huge damage, but they remain only inferences. The fact is, and one has to say this frankly and acknowledge the fact, we don't know, and in light of that, we have to also accept that any analysis of the capabilities of the Oreshnik based on the damage done at the moment is literally based on very shaky foundations. So there it is. This is all I'm going to say. I'm going to make one further final observation, which I'm surprised nobody else has made. Some of the battle damage shown in the satellite photos which has been released to the Yuzhmash factory is extremely old, well over a year old. It looks as if the Russians have launched several attacks on the Yuzhmash factory at various times, and it also looks as if the Ukrainians have barely made an effort to conduct significant repairs. Now that could be because the main workshops have not been affected. Some of them are said to be deep underground, but it does again suggest that there's a chaotic situation in Ukraine. They're only able to patch up some of the damage in some places. They're short of resources and perhaps skilled personnel. Some other damage in other places is just left as it is. So there's holes in the roof, and a year can pass and those holes are not repaired. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the Oreshnik this morning and the Yuzhmash factory, except once and finally to acknowledge that I think Amerikanets has acted in a very honourable and very dignified way, which enhances my opinion of him, both as a person and as an analyst. Let's move on to other things. As I said, I've only got a limited amount of time, and in my opinion, the single most important thing that has happened is that President Putin of Russia has gone, and on top of that mammoth press conference and Q&A that he gave a few days ago, lasting 4.5 hours, he's also given an interview to the Kremlin's favorite journalist, Pavel Zarubin, and it was made apparently early today. Now, the Kremlin, as at the time making this program, has not yet provided us with a transcript, either in Russian or in English. But it seems that the interview discusses at some length the question of Russia's relations with the Western powers. And apparently, Putin, as is often the case with him, went into long, discursive discussions, reaching far back into Russian history. He was talking at length, for example, about the 19th century and about the Crimean War and about how the whole of the West basically ganged up against Russia at that time. And after the war had ended, the Russians sorted themselves out. And he refers to the famous words of the Russian Chancellor of that period, Prince Gorchakov, who wrote in French, by the way, to the world powers after comments about Russia having retreated into angry, sulking isolation after its defeat in the Crimean War. Gorchakov famously responded that Russia is not sulking, it's composing itself. It's working things out. Anyway, he talks all about that. He talks about how the Crimean War was World War Zero, because it was a war of all the great powers of that time, or at least the two main Western powers of that time, Britain and France against Russia. But he said that international relations is something that goes into constant flux. Everything changes, only interests remain invariable. Today's enemies can become tomorrow's friends. And by the time of the First World War, Britain and France, which had been Russia's enemies in the Crimean War, had become Russia's allies. So he said it's not impossible that one day relations between the West, the Western powers, and Russia will be repaired. But, and this is the key point in his interview, he went out of his way to make clear that the West should not expect what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s to take place again. When moves are finally made to restore relations between Russia and the West, there will be no surrender by the Russians, no capitulation of their positions as took place in the late 1980s and 1990s. And here I'm going to quote the summary of the interview, this part of the summary of the interview, Putin's interview, given by the official Russian news agency TASS, which provides some extensive quotes of things that Putin has said. And it says that TASS says this: the previous generation of Russian politicians chose the course towards the country's destruction for the sake of joining the so-called civilized world, but this was what the West wanted. And then there's a direct quote, and this is Putin's words: in the newest history, we have passed the period when our previous generation of politicians, in my view, set course even towards the destruction of their own country in the hope that Russia would become a part of the so-called civilized world. And this was what the civilized world wanted. As soon as Russia's potential dwindled and it became weaker, they, the West, began to ruin it instead of making it an equitable partner and a participant in this civilized world. The words civilized world are obviously intended to be in quotation marks. Unfortunately, this is how the world is arranged, at least today. And if we will build relations with someone, we will build them only on the basis of the interests of the Russian state. And TASS said that Putin said that when speaking about the prospect of Russia eventually normalizing its relations with the West. Now, I think these are important words for two reasons. Firstly, Putin is basically saying, yes, we're open to normalization with the Western powers, but it will have to be ultimately on our terms, taking into account our interests. We're not prepared to do what we did in the late 1980s and 1990s and surrender our positions and sacrifice our interests, because we've discovered that when we do that, all that happens is the West takes advantage. Now, he's not wrong here, by the way. I remember in the 1970s and 1980s, before Gorbachev appeared on the scene, there were endless statements, endless proposals and suggestions made by all sorts of people, including many well-intentioned people, to the government in Moscow, to the Soviet Union in other words, asking it to take risks for peace. That was the expression that was always used, that they should take risks for peace. And of course Gorbachev came along, and that is exactly what they did, with the consequences that we all know. Well, Putin is saying that this time the Russians are not going to be prepared to take risks for peace in the same sort of way. So that's the first thing I would say about this. We are, unless there is a change in attitude in the West, therefore, likely to see a very long period in which relations between Russia and the West remain tense, and people who expect the Russians to make significant concessions in order to ease tensions this time are likely to be mistaken. But the second point that derives from this comes back to the topics that I discussed in my two previous programs. If Putin says that the Russians are not prepared to sacrifice their interests in general in order to improve relations with the West, then they are most unlikely to sacrifice what they see as their interests, in particular, the particular being the conflict in Ukraine, in order to improve their relations with the West. These words further shut the door, or so it seems to me, to the idea that the Russians are in any kind of mood to make significant concessions to the Western powers in order to see some kind of settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. So, coming back to what I've said in my previous programs, Putin repeatedly says, Russian officials repeatedly say, that the terms for a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict must be those that Putin outlined in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June of this year, which in effect means Istanbul Plus. Those who expect Putin to rapidly retreat from that, to make major concessions, all the indications from the Russians, from Putin himself, suggest are going to be deeply disappointed. I think Putin means what he says about the terms that he set out in June. And I have to say that this interview with Zarubin strongly reinforces that view. Just to say. So, there we are. Putin, once again, making his position as clear as it can be made. And to repeat another point which I've also made in various programs, I don't detect any nuance in terms of anything that has been said by any other senior Russian official, including any of the powerful politicians who might potentially take over from Putin, which suggests that they may think that Putin is taking an unduly hard line, and that if he were to leave the scene because he falls ill, because he decides to go, or something like that, I don't see any sign that any one of these people, if through some unexplained process they were to become the decision makers, I see nothing to suggest that they would take a softer line than he is taking. In fact, in many cases, my impression is that their line is going to be even tougher and harder than his. So there we are. So that's what I want to say about all of the discussions about Putin, the Russians suddenly beating some big retreat from Istanbul Plus. All of those theories, ideas, plans for freezes, ceasefires, deployment of European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, postponement of NATO entry, all of those things, they're either the product of wishful thinking, the belief that the Russians will retreat from their positions, which they show no sign of doing, or, as I discussed in my program yesterday, ideas floated by people, especially in Europe, who don't really want a diplomatic settlement of the war at all, and who are deliberately drawing the new Trump administration towards proposals, towards ideas which will be made to the Russians in the full knowledge that they are unacceptable to the Russians and that the Russians will reject them. So there it is. I'm now going to briefly touch on the latest developments in the war. There hasn't been a huge amount of news about other things, but briefly, the Russian offensives continue right across the contact line, and we've had confirmation of this from Ukraine's own general staff. We're told that General Syrsky, the head of the Ukrainian military situation, has spoken to Admiral Tony Radakin, the chief of the UK of the British Defence Staff, and that he said that the situation remained extremely tense, and that the situation, in other words, when they say it's tense, that it is in fact continuing to deteriorate. And by the way, it's interesting that Syrsky is speaking to Radakin, because in my opinion, Radakin has made a whole set of decisions about the conduct of the war, which have actually put Ukraine in a worse position than the one it would otherwise have been in. I believe it is now openly reported in Ukraine that he was the main advocate of the Kherson disaster. I suspect that he has also been an advocate of the missile strikes using the Storm Shadows on Russia. Radakin impresses me as a very tough British hardliner. And I have to say this, I think his advice to Ukraine has been consistently bad. But that's my view. Anyway, put that aside. Syrsky says that the situation is very tense, which means that it is very bad. In fact, Simplicius the Thinker today has a comment by a Ukrainian commentator who is predicting that the situation is so bad, the losses in Ukraine are so high, that unless there is a sudden change, the entire Ukrainian army could start to collapse in the spring of 2025. And this person says that he has been warning that this could happen way as early as the first weeks of this year. He predicted that the situation would begin to deteriorate seriously in the summer, which is indeed what we have seen, and that it would collapse next spring, in the spring of 2025. And he says that nothing that has happened causes him to change his predictions about the course of events. And this is a Ukrainian commentator who is saying these things. Anyway, there it is. So, the Ukrainians themselves accepting that there is a very, very bad situation on the front lines. And this is true. There's been reports now that the Russians have made very big advances in the Kursk pocket. The main battle, again, seems to be focused on this small village, Malaya Loknya. The Ukrainians captured it in the early weeks of their offensive. The Russians then recaptured it. A big battle then took place. It looks as if at some point the Russians withdrew from Malaya Loknya. That appears to have been done at roughly the same time that the Russians began their counterattack in the Kursk region from the west, pushing the Ukrainians away from places like Korenovo and Snagust and those places. At the same time, they appear to have retreated from Malaya Lochnia. Well, that advance from the west continues, and it looks as if Russian troops, and I do use the expression Russian troops, if you listen to the Ukrainians, all the fighting that's taking place in Kursk region now appears to be between the Ukrainians and the North Koreans. Only the Ukrainians have never provided us with any definite evidence that the people that they are actually fighting are North Koreans rather than Russians. Just saying. But anyway, the latest evidence is that the Russians have been advancing towards Malaya Lochnia from the west, that they've just captured a village called Krugloykaya, and that they have almost reached Malaya Lochnia. In fact, Redovka yesterday was talking about the Ukrainians preparing to withdraw from Malaya Lochnia. Malaya Lochnia is located not that far north from Suja. If Malaya Lochnia falls, with the Russians now apparently close to attacking Selidovo to the southwest of Suja, and the Russians having captured Plyokhovo to the southeast of Suja, and having advanced some distance westwards from Plyokhovo, and established themselves also in a forest area south of the border in Sumy region, south of Plyokhovo. Well, it looks as if at some point over the next week, the Kursk pocket is going to be reduced to Suja itself. Tiny, small area of territory, one that the Russians are coming increasingly close to encircling, to turning into a cauldron. In fact, and I get to say it, I think that the Ukrainians should have retreated from Kursk region way back in August, when it became clear that they were not going to succeed in the original objective of the operation, which, in my opinion, obviously was to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. I thought that they should have retreated then. Well, they chose to stay. I certainly think, given the trend of events on the battlefronts in Kursk region, they should be retreating now. Putin, of course, is claiming that the Ukrainians have lost more equipment in Kursk region than they did in the entirety of 2023, including during the period of the summer 2023 offensive that the Ukrainians launched in Zaporozhye region, which turned out to be such a complete disaster. Well, that's Kursk. There are reports. The report started yesterday that the Russians have now established positions close to the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson city itself. That they, in other words, that they have crossed the Dnieper and established some positions on the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson city. And there are all kinds of rumors and reports circulating that some kind of operation to cross the Dnieper in Kherson region is in the process of preparation, and that the Russians have assembled large numbers of boats in order to transport their infantry across. And as we know, over the course of the last few months, they've been working to recapture all the various islands in the Dnieper, bringing them closer to the West Bank. Now, this may be true. I mean, who knows what the Russians are planning? There's very, very large forces, Russian forces, in Kherson region, on the east bank of Kherson region, and in Zaporozhye. Group of forces, Dnieper, according to the Ukrainians, numbers 130,000 men. It's commanded by one of Russia's most competent generals, General Templinsky, who also happens to be the commander of Russia's airborne forces. He knows Kherson region very, very well. It was he who defended the city of Kherson and the surrounding countryside in the summer and autumn of 2022. So, I am not discounting this theory that, that the Russians are indeed preparing some big cross-river amphibious operation to recapture Kherson city and Kherson, the western areas of Kherson. The only point I would make is that if they are planning to do something like this, then doing it in midwinter would be, I would have thought, a very significant challenge. I mean, there will be ice on the Dnieper, which will complicate movement of boats, I would have thought, especially in areas where there are islands, and so that the currents of the Dnieper are relatively slow. I discussed during the Klinky operation the very, very great risks of moving large bodies of men, especially at night, over the ice. Certainly not something which, as a walker, I would advise people to do. In fact, I would strongly warn them against even thinking about it. So, well, maybe the Russians do have these plans. Templinsky, as I said, is a very capable general. The Russians are said to have a great deal of knowledge and experience of amphibious operations, or at least cross-river operations. Maybe something is indeed in the works. But if it is successfully done, it would be a very notable feat of arms indeed. Just saying. And that does make me just a little skeptical. Anyway, put all that aside. The situation in Kurakovo is turning very bad for the Ukrainians. They've been driven out of the town itself. The villages south of Kurakovo are falling. The Ukrainian troops, several hundred of them in Kurakovo, are supposed to be huddling around the big thermal power plant to the west of Kurakovo. There are suggestions that this is going to be a rerun of the story of Mariupol and of the Azovstal factory, that the Ukrainian troops will retreat into the power plant and try and defend themselves there, that the Russians will surround them, that they'll be trapped and eventually forced into surrender in the way that the Azov Brigade was forced to surrender back in 2022 after it got trapped in the subterranean sections of the Azovstal factory. I wonder, I think that the men who are defending the thermal power plant are not made of the same ideological stuff as the men who fought in Mariupol. And my own sense is that they will probably do what Ukrainian soldiers have done in other places, in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, when they sense, in Ugleda, when they sense that the trap is about to close, they will run away. Run away in midwinter across the fields in the dark, hunted by the Russians. Many of them will die. Many of them will face an agonizing and terrible death. Wounded, unable to move, dying of exposure in the fields. But I think that is much more likely what they're going to do than try to rerun the heroic pose of the Azov fighters in Mariupol. All I would say is that it might actually be wiser for them to remain in the thermal power station, go through the motions of resisting, and then surrender en masse, which is, after all, what the Azov people in Mariupol eventually did. That way, they all survived. Doing what I've said, fleeing across the fields, would be to invite a likely and very grisly death. But I don't expect the soldiers in the thermal power plant to do that, to do what I've suggested. Anyway, elsewhere, further north, the Russians are continuing to advance around in the villages around Pokrovsk. And there was some rather interesting news that came up about the Ukrainian counterattack that the new Ukrainian commander in the Pokrovsk area, General Tarnavsky, ordered. Because it turns out that that counterattack, which was intended to try to recapture the village of Shevchenko to the south of Pokrovsk, that counterattack was carried out by the 3rd Azov Brigade. This is the 2nd brigade set up by the Azov movement. The original Azov Brigade, the people who got trapped in the Azovstal factory, that has been reconstituted as well, and I believe it's called the 112th Brigade. That is the original pure Azov Brigade. This is a spin-off. It shares the same ideology and perspectives, and apparently it's a huge brigade, almost the size of a division, and it's been used in various battles. It was used in the fighting west of Avdiivka after Avdiivka fell. It was briefly sent by Syrsky to try to stabilize the battle in Avdiivka. That was then almost immediately pulled out, or rather, it refused to go. It was also sent to Chasov Yar to try to protect the micro-district west of the canal, or rather the aqueduct. At least that's, to the best of my recollection, that was what happened, and it apparently refused orders there again. But anybody, by all accounts, it is a powerful, very powerful, undoubtedly elite formation. And Tarnavsky sent it into battle, and it was comprehensively defeated. It was completely defeated in the battle for Shevchenko. It's untrue that the entire brigade was destroyed, but it does seem to have suffered very significant losses and was thrown back. Now, the fact that it is present in the Pokrovsk area shows that Syrsky and Zelensky are now finally taking the Pokrovsk situation seriously, and that they have sent powerful reinforcements there. And there's been pictures of Leopard 2 tanks operating in the Pokrovsk area and being destroyed by the Russians. So the Ukrainians are now sending some of their best troops to the area of Pokrovsk. They realize the importance of Pokrovsk. But interestingly, despite that, the Russians continue advancing. So you can draw whatever conclusions from that you will. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss in detail what's going on in other places. There's apparently been a significant victory by the Russians in the Kupiansk area. A place called Lozova has now been captured. I'm not exactly sure what that is, by the way. Toretsk, as I said, looks like it's going to fall probably before the new year. The end game in these battles for these towns can sometimes take a while, but the main fighting in Toretsk looks like it's over. Suffice to say that Syrsky himself admits to a tense situation, which means that the situation continues to be very bad. And, well, Trump might decide. There are clear efforts being made to make him decide to continue to send arms supplies to Ukraine and financial support to Ukraine. But the trajectory is clear. The Russians continue their advance, and there's nothing, as I've said before, that can be done to change the course of events. Now, I'm going to just finish this summary about the Ukraine situation by saying that the Russians and the Ukrainians, one thing they have done is that they've swapped bodies of dead soldiers, and a lot of people have pointed out that the ratio is around 10 dead Ukrainian bodies for every dead Russian. Now, some people are extrapolating that to say that that must mean that Ukrainian casualties are 10 times higher than Russian casualties. I don't think that one can draw such a conclusion, given that we're only talking about hundreds of bodies in a war in which thousands or tens of thousands of people are being killed. But nonetheless, it is suggestive. It does seem as if in all of these swaps, many more Ukrainian bodies are returned than Russian ones. And this isn't the first time that this has happened. With this swap, it's been the consistent pattern, and the disproportion between dead Russian bodies and dead Ukrainian bodies is gradually getting bigger and bigger. With every exchange, more Ukrainian bodies are released by the Russians than Russian bodies are released by the Ukrainians. There's a detailed and interesting discussion about all of this by Simplicius the Thinker on his blog. So anyway, this is my summary of the events today in the Ukraine war. Just to say again that the most interesting thing is these words of Putin, that Russia will not sacrifice its interests, its vital interests, again, in order to improve relations with the West. They tried it before, and the results were disastrous. They're not going to make the same mistake again. And that suggests to me that expectations of some sort of rapid agreement to end the war on anything like the terms that have been floating around in the West, it's not going to happen. Now, there's two last things I want to discuss. Firstly, there is a story circulating on the internet that Putin recently said that war has been declared, presumably by the West, on the Russian world, on the Ruski Mir, on the people of Russia. Well, he has actually said that, but I think that people are perhaps reading more into his words, into those words, than Putin actually intended. Because Putin was speaking at a meeting of the Federation Council, which was about families and about the demographic situation in Russia, and which was about increasing, helping families in order to improve the birth rate. And I'm going to quote his exact words as they are published on the Kremlin website. He says this: I have something to say in conclusion. My colleagues from the Duma said in their speeches that war has been declared on the Russian world, and this is true. They said that 1.6% of the birth rate is not enough because it means extinction. Reproduction alone is 2.1%. In other words, what they mean is, what actually means here is 1.6 families in Russia. I understand the real figure is about 1.4, 1.5, that they either have 1.4, 1.5, this is obviously an average, children, that they have fewer than 2 children, that this is the average. Most families in Russia today have fewer than 2 children. In fact, most families in Russia, the largest number, most families in Russia have only 1 child. And Putin says that reproduction alone is 2.1%, expanded reproduction is 2.3%. So you need families to have most families to have more than 2 children in order to increase the population. And he says we must strive for this, that is right, and I spoke about this yesterday. And he gave a detailed account of some of the measures that might be taken, and there's long discussions about this. This is a topic close to Putin's heart. It's been discussed before. When I was in Hungary, I found that the Hungarian government also takes this extremely seriously, and it's also been discussed at enormous length there as well. So when one reads it all in that way, these words that war has been declared on the Russian world suddenly look rather less portentous than they would when made in isolation. Putin was going along with what some other people were saying, all of this in the context of a discussion about the birth rate. I think that, as I said, too much is being made of these words, which were obviously spoken in passing. But much more interesting has been what Putin has been saying about the situation in Syria. And I'm not going to repeat here again. I'm going to read out what he said. But of course, he discussed the Syrian situation at great length in his press conference and Q&A. I've discussed this in my previous program. I spoke about the very cool way in which he discussed the situation in Syria, about how HTS, many think, is now a reformed organization. I don't know whether Putin himself believes that, but he seemed to be open to the idea that it might be. After all, as he said, the Western powers seem to think it is. So he was very cool, very calm about it. He said that the bases in Syria might be retained and used for humanitarian purposes. There were all kinds of issues with the Kurds and in the east, that Turkey had legitimate security concerns in northern Syria in order to protect its borders, that Israel also had security concerns which were causing it to occupy large amount of Syrian territory, though he made it clear that he didn't think that what the Israelis were doing was right. And he had various things to say about President Erdogan, fairly respectful things, but some of the compliments about Erdogan came across to me as a little loaded, just to say. But anyway, he certainly didn't lay in to Erdogan in any strong way. And he continued to speak about the need to maintain good relations with Turkey. It was all very cool, very balanced, very calm. And I have to say, thinking about it and reading all those words again, my overwhelming sense is that Putin, despite the discussions that are taking place with HTS, in his own mind, he has accepted the reality that Russia is going to quit Syria. When he talked about the bases, he spoke about them being used for humanitarian purposes, which appears to preclude the idea of them being used for any particular military purpose. And instead, what we've been reading and hearing about is that the Russians have been moving personnel and military material to Libya instead. So I would suggest that this is actually a very realistic position. The contrast with the West is truly remarkable. I mean, in the case of the West, when things begin to go wrong, as for example they did in Afghanistan, we tend to cling on. We double. Let's talk about troop surges, as there was during the Iraq War. Let's talk about surges in Afghanistan, as I also remember. The mother of all bombs was apparently used on one occasion, as I also remember. All kinds of things were done in Afghanistan. 20 years the West stayed there. I can't remember how much money the West expended on the war in Afghanistan. I think in the United States it was in excess of $1 trillion, but I might be overstating things. The contrast with this acceptance of reality that Syria is lost, that the investment there ultimately failed to pay off, that it's time therefore to prepare to leave and to do so in good order and on reasonable terms with the people who will remain there. I find that actually telling, and for me it's refreshing. It again shows that the Russians, Putin certainly, have their heads screwed on in the right way. I can't imagine that the United States, for example, would have withdrawn from Syria in quite such a relaxed way, that they would have acted in the way that Putin has done. On the contrary, I would expect the US to find all kinds of ways to interfere in the situation, to disrupt the situation in the new Syria, to create trouble and chaos there on top of the trouble and chaos that there already is, to look to exact some kind of revenge, ultimately making the situation worse, and again committing itself to an unending prolongation of its own involvement in Syria. After all, that's what it did in Afghanistan, and of course it's still got its bases in Iraq, and it's got its bases in all sorts of other places, and it hasn't in any of these places turned out that well for the United States, so it seems to me. I've already said in previous programs that the fact that Erdogan up to now has wanted the Russians to stay was a reason why the Russians might decide that it was better for them to go. When Putin was talking about transferring the bases to humanitarian purposes. He was clearly signalling to Erdogan that the bases are not, as far as the Russians are concerned, any longer seen as serious military assets. So if Erdogan thinks that allowing the bases to stay will give him leverage over the Russians, then he is mistaken. And perhaps in response to those words of Putin, we're now starting to get statements coming out of Turkey that Turkey wants all foreign forces, except its own, of course, to leave Syria, including the Americans and the Israelis, and, of course, ultimately the Russians. From Erdogan's point of view, he's probably an emotional man. He's undoubtedly read Putin's words correctly. He's not going to get the leverage he wants, so he wants the Russians to go. And we've had a flood of angry commentary coming out of Turkey over the last couple of days. Turkey has started to criticize Israel for its moves in southern Syria. Turkey is becoming even more angry and aggressive about the position of the Kurds in eastern Syria. I suspect that this whole situation is going to start to deteriorate fairly soon between Turkey and its erstwhile allies, Israel and the United States. And I think that any idea that there's going to be a negotiation of spheres of influence in Syria between Turkey, Israel, and the United States is likely to be stillborn, which will mean that the problems between these countries are likely to grow. And for further evidence of what I mean, just go to this article in the published, I believe, by Middle East, by the Free Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, by Michael Rubin, neocon royalty, by the way, in the United States. He's been around also for a very long time. He was one of the major advocates of the Iraq War, as I remember, in the early 2000s. Anyway, the article, which is dated 17th December 2024, it has this rather strong title: "The United States needs to prepare to kill Turks in Syria." That's the title of the article. And then there is a long tirade about Turkish policy in Syria and how it's backing jihadi fighters in Syria who are hostile to Israel and to the United States. And it ends with these words: "It may be diplomatically impolitic to say directly, but if Turkish-backed forces encourage terrorism and continue to pose threats to American forces countering ISIS, in other words, in the Kurdish regions, it behooves the United States to begin a conversation about whether it may be necessary to target Turkish terror sponsors in the region. Turkey is a NATO member, but striking at its forces outside Turkey's boundaries would not trigger NATO's self-defense clauses. Nor should there be outrage at such discussion, especially when Turkey's actions already cross the Rubicon and place American forces and interests in jeopardy. The best opportunity to avoid direct conflict would be to recognize the trajectory of Turkey's aggression, notice the word aggression, outside its borders, and the impact of its salami slicing tactics, which could endanger Americans, and to let Turkey know, in the interests of conflict avoidance, what the United States will be willing to do to protect its own personnel. If Turkey is willing to kill Americans operating in pursuit of official American policy inside Syria, then the United States should adopt the same policy and be willing to kill Turks outside Turkey's own borders. It is a hard conversation, but it is increasingly a necessary one. Well, there you go. Imagine an article like that being written by an institute in Moscow. What would people say? Well, there it is. I suspect that this article is going to be prescient, that as Syria disintegrates, the disintegration of Syria accelerates, all the various powers, Turkey, the United States, Israel, or rather I should say the US-Israel alliance is going to find itself in increasing conflict with Turkey. Perhaps in the light of the way that Michael Rubin is putting it, and he's an influential man in the United States, the moment has come to belt up for the ride. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also, please don't forget to check out our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.